Welcome everyone in. Today we'll be doing the egg market overview for H2 for 2024 here. We'll give everyone just a few more minutes to load into the webinar today. And Karen, you can go to the next slide if you want here. While we wait, I just want to give a general overview about Expana, our new brand. Some of you may know us or have known of us before as Mintech or Erner Berry or Comtel. Feed Info, Tropical Research Services, and Strategy Grains are now all under one umbrella called Expana. We've now pushed ourselves into one brand as the first food-focused PRA. We've gone through our most recent fourth compliant audit for IOSCO. And again, we'll just be covering some of the egg topics today. We do have this as a series of 7 webinars covering 7 different commodities. So if you are interested in a different commodity, you can go check out expana.com/insights, which I'll put into the chat here in a moment, where you can see those webinar series that'll be launching over the next couple weeks here. With me today, I have Karen Rispoli and Fabian O'Donoghue, who will be going over the egg market here in just a few minutes. I would encourage everybody that's in, if you have any questions, to put your questions into the chat. We will take those offline and send you answers afterwards. So as we go through this presentation, if you have any questions or there's anything that jumps out to you, we'll definitely send that. This is being recorded, and we'll also send the presentation itself to everyone that attends afterwards. So we have that ready for you. And with that, I think we're good to go ahead and kick off now. As I said before, we have with us Karen Rispoli, our managing editor for eggs, and I'll go ahead and hand this over to her now.
All right, thanks, Noah. Yes, good morning or good afternoon, depending on which corner of the globe you are joining us from today. As Noah mentioned, I'm Karen Rispoli, managing editor of the Egg Desk here at Expana. I came to Expana by way of our legacy Erner Berry brand 5.5 years ago, and am based in Toms River, New Jersey. I oversee and actively report on pretty much all aspects of the U.S. egg markets, including conventional shell eggs, cage-free shell eggs, breaking stock, and egg products. And in addition to that, I also contribute to our market reporting efforts in the EU a few days a week. I will say that while I won't deny that getting up a little extra early to make those international calls isn't always my favorite thing to do, the global perspective that I gain from engaging with participants throughout Europe has truly been invaluable. That said, I am going to leave the European content for today's webinar to my colleague Fabienne, who will take over after I have walked you through what's been happening here in the US. So with that, let's get things started. I figured I would kick off with an update on a topic that has been a dominating factor in the marketplace for the past 2.5 years now, and that, of course, is bird flu. The first detection of this current strain occurred here in the US in February of 2022, and since that time, more than 100 million birds have been impacted, the majority of which have been laying hens. In the past, when the bird flu would hit, it would wreak havoc for a few months and then die off with the summer heat. But this current variation has proven to be virtually interminable, withstanding everything from extreme heat to ice cold temperatures. It was even found in Antarctica. It does quiet down at times. Last year, for example, we saw an 11-month stretch with no new detections, but it never fully disappears. And this year has proven to be no different. As you can see here, we had a little bit of a lull in the first quarter, particularly in February and March. But on the first day of the second quarter, which also happened to be the day after Easter, there was an outbreak confirmed in Texas. And within a matter of days, several more positives popped up in Michigan. We had another small hiatus in June, but then it reared its ugly head again this month on a few farms in Colorado. So all told, as you can see here, we've lost about 18.5 million layers year to date. Now, what's a little bit different about this year than the previous two is that the bird flu is no longer limited to just birds. It's now infecting dairy cattle throughout the country as well. 168 dairy farms across 13 states have now been infected. And unlike layers, which have very strict rules as it relates to HPAI, there hasn't been a precedent for this. And so therefore, the same level of testing and regulations are not in place to help prevent further spread. With layers, the government takes a stamp out approach, meaning when a farm tests positive, the entire farm has to be depopulated immediately. But the bird flu is not fatal to cattle. They're simply hosts. They get sick, they take a little bit of medicine, and they go on their merry way. So clearly, there's no need or justification for depopulating cattle, and certainly not at $2,500 a head. The problem is that the dairy farms seem to have a very heavy viral load, which then enters into the environment and can be transmitted by a variety of ways to layer farms, including through workers, manure, wild birds, or even just through dust or air. So, needless to say, this new development has added yet another layer of complexity and uncertainty to an already stressful and taxing situation. All right, so let's dive into the numbers a bit. As mentioned, we've lost about 18.5 million layers so far this year to bird flu. So where does that leave production? The latest chicken and eggs report from the USDA, which came out just last week, put the July flock at just under 305 million layers. Apart from 2022, shortly after the bird flu began to spread, the last time we saw production at a similar level was in 2014. The difference, though, is that we have a lot more people in this country than we did back in 2014. The latest census data from the US shows that we have a current population of 336 million, which is up 17 million from 2014. And that's just the people that the Census Bureau has accounted for. We've had record level migrants making their way across the southern border for months, if not years, which means that there are likely a lot more mouths to feed in this country than the numbers even suggest. But let's just put that aside for a moment and assume that the population is in fact 336 million. We're looking at a differential of about 32 million between the number of people in the country and the number of layers. Now, conventional wisdom has always suggested that you need about one bird per person to account for current consumption and demand growth. And if those numbers still hold true, then it's safe to say we are severely underproduced as a nation right now. So, what kind of an impact has this had on the shell egg market? Before we delve into that, one thing I'd like to note here is that when it comes to the bird flu and production losses, it's not always just a matter of simple subtraction. Where and when a virus strikes plays a significant role in the impact that it makes in the marketplace, as does what sector that farm services and the type of production that it houses. In the fall, for example, many of the outbreaks were occurring on farms that mainly feed into the food processing industry. And so the impact on shell eggs, at least at the outset, was mitigated to some degree. What we've seen this year, however, is a significant impact on farms that feed into the retail sector. So to answer that question, what has the impact been? In a word, bullish. While 2022 still holds the record for the highest market value with a peak of $5.46 a dozen, 2024 has been consistently elevated. At this point in the year, Midwest large has averaged $2.47 a dozen, making this the strongest year-to-date market in history. Now, 247 may not sound all that striking to you without much context, especially after seeing so much volatility over the past couple of years. So just for a little perspective, in 2021, which is the last year without bird flu, the year-to-date average in July was $1.12 per dozen. And if we're talking about the year-to-date average throughout history, prices at this point of the year have averaged just 98 cents per dozen. So we're looking at prices that are essentially 86% greater than normal. Now, if we're talking about the cage-free market, the impact here has been even more profound. As I just mentioned, there's a lot to be said for not just the total number of hens that are impacted, but also what type of production these farms house. And of the 18 or so million that have been wiped out this year, the majority of them have been cage-free or some other type of specialty egg, whether it's organic, branded, or 144 square inch production. And so the impact on the California market, where only cage-free eggs can be sold, has been rather severe. Large values in California this month climbed to a high of $4.43 per dozen, which is a new record for the month of July. Within the last week, we have finally seen a bit of a stabilization because buyers are starting to push back against these higher prices. But the reality is that cage-free supplies remain extremely low. Inventories last week dropped to just 248,000 cases, which is the lowest they've been since January 2023. Now, I would be remiss to suggest that These elevated prices for both conventional and cage-free have been driven entirely by supply constraints. Supply, of course, is just one part of the equation, demand being the other. Production losses could be substantial, but in the absence of any real meaningful demand, the market might not see as strong of a reaction. But that has not been the case this year. This is a look at some retail data that the American Egg Board is kind enough to share with us in partnership with Nielsen. And the bright green line represents 2024. As you can see, sales are definitely trending higher this year. In fact, the only other time in recent history that sales were consistently higher was back in 2020 during the COVID lockdowns, which of course left consumers with no choice but to eat more of their meals at home. Even now, as we move through the summer months, when consumer preferences typically shift to more seasonal options like cold cereal or fresh fruit, we continue to hear from suppliers that orders are unseasonably strong. As you would expect, constrained supplies plus strong demand has resulted in extremely low inventories. Earlier this month, shell egg stocks on hand dropped to less than 1.2 million cases. The only other times that inventories have been similarly low in the past 5 years was this past January, following a series of bird flu outbreaks, and back in March of 2020, during the start of the pandemic when people were hoarding eggs and toilet paper, though not necessarily in that order. So what is driving all of this demand? If I had to point to one particular factor as the leading cause, it would have to be inflation. As anyone who has grocery shopped in the past 2 years can tell you, grocery prices are through the roof, and it's been a real pain point for consumers. If you happen to be at our executive conference in Las Vegas back in April, you've already heard this, so I apologize for the redundancy, but I had shared at that time the results of a Harris poll from earlier in the year that I think bears repeating because it really speaks to what's at the heart of this demand. They had polled consumers to ask about their grocery shopping experiences, and 59% of respondents indicated that they felt some sort of negative emotion when grocery shopping, with anger being the most common among them. And let's be real, who can't relate to that? Since the start of the pandemic, grocery prices in the US have gone up by 25%. But the harsh reality is that wages for a lot of people have not kept pace. This graph shows personal savings as a percent of disposable income, and the picture is pretty clear. All of the savings that were accumulated during the pandemic have since been completely wiped out. In fact, the last time consumers had this little disposable income was during the housing crisis of 2008. And what we've seen within the egg industry is that consumers, as they often do in times of economic struggle, have been leaning more heavily on eggs as an affordable source of protein. One of the other things that we've seen is that consumers are reverting to eating more of their meals at home. After the pandemic, people were not only flush with cash, but they were anxious to get back out there and start enjoying those restaurant dining experiences again. And for a while, the cost of food at home was increasing at a much faster rate than the cost of food away from home. In fact, I remember seeing a series of videos online some time ago where people were providing meal prep hacks using takeout food because it was actually cheaper to buy a tray of chicken from a local restaurant, for example, than to buy packages of chicken breasts at the store. But as you can see, at about this time last year, that script was flipped. While the cost of both food at home and away continues to rise, restaurant prices are now increasing at a much faster rate. Restaurants are struggling with labor challenges and ongoing supply chain issues, which are now being passed down to consumers through rising menu costs. And with that, people are once again preparing more of their meals at home. This naturally has come at the expense of food service demand. According to the National Restaurant Association, restaurant operators reported net declines in both same-store sales and customer traffic in May, which continues a soft patch that began earlier this year. And to further back that up, they also conducted a survey which showed that 43% of consumers say they are not visiting restaurants or ordering takeout as often as they would like. So, with food service being down, some might speculate that prices for breaking stock and in turn egg products would also be down, but that has actually not been the case. As with any business, the goal for producers and processors is to extract the most value that they can for their goods. And over the last year or so, that value has often been found in the shell egg market, whether it be domestically or in Canada, where demand has also been quite strong. That has not only cut down on the volume of breaking stock available to processors, but some processors have been capitalizing on those opportunities as well by selling their own nest run supply into the retail market or into Canada, and then supplementing their internal needs in the spot market. So that's really kept the entire landscape pretty snug overall. And as you can see on the graph here, prices very elevated. This is the first year since our breaking stock quote originated back in 2008 that prices have yet to dip below the dollar mark. Breaking stock prices year to date have averaged $1.43 a dozen, which is 60% higher than the 10-year average. And the story is very much the same with liquids. This is a look at raw whole egg, which you can see is trending substantially above historical norms. The other thing that I think is worth noting on this graph is that the trend line typically starts to edge higher as we move into September, which, believe it or not, is right around the corner. This is usually when processors start to gear up for the holiday season before retail needs start to kick in, which then makes it harder for them to access raw material. With availability already limited during what is typically a sluggish period of the year, there are definitely some concerns among market participants about what the supply situation will look like when the season really gets going. What's also rather surprising is that supplies are this tight, even with dried processing volumes as low as they are. Very few processors are drying anything beyond what they currently have orders for. And in fact, some have gotten even a little bit behind on production in an attempt to either keep up with their liquid demand or to seize opportunities in the shell egg market. USDA data shows that monthly dried processing volumes are down 87% versus the 10-year average and are currently the lowest on record, dating all the way back to 1996. All right, so the last thing that I will touch on here is the export market. Canada, as I have alluded to a few times, continues to be our strongest trade partner. Volumes to Canada have barely skipped a beat over the past few years, and we've seen that trend continue into 2024 with volumes of 29% year over year. But elsewhere, volumes are down significantly, and that's primarily a reflection of both HPAI and price. Some countries are simply not willing to import eggs from the US because we have continued to see the bird flu pop up over and over again throughout the past 2 years. But in some cases, it's simply just a matter of price. I would say this is particularly true of Hong Kong, which up until a couple of years ago was also a very strong trade partner, but our prices are just too high to compete on the global stage at this point. As a matter of fact, our prices for small eggs, which is what Hong Kong would most often purchase, are currently higher than what large eggs were priced for just a few years ago. And so we have seen export volumes to Hong Kong drop a staggering 92% year over year. And the situation is very much the same with Mexico, where exports are down 67% year over year. So those declines have tempered to some degree, what's gone on because with Canada's demand, but total exports overall are still down 29% year ago levels. All right, so that's a wrap on what's happened year to date. As far as what to watch out for in the second half of the year and beyond, this is where I would be looking. Foremost, the ongoing spread of bird flu. In 2022, we lost about 12.5 million chickens between September and December. And last year, we lost about 11 million in an even shorter window. So if history is any kind of an indication, there is certainly a chance for another resurgence of bird flu in the fall. I'd also note that up until now, a lot of the focus with HPAI has really been on production. But moving forward, we might start to see more conversation develop as it relates to the impact on demand. We're seeing more and more headlines about bird flu in cattle and unfortunately in people, which has the potential to damage consumer perceptions. I would also keep an eye on retail demand patterns. One of the contributing factors to the record high prices that we saw back in 2022 was a severe disconnect between wholesale pricing and retail pricing. Retailers were fighting for market share and using eggs as a loss leader in order to garner more foot traffic. So even as the bird flu was spreading and prices were rising, consumers were shielded from those increases, which stoked even more demand. The cure for high prices is high prices, but that's only true if consumers are actually experiencing them. Now, looking further down the road, I would say flock expansion is something else to be aware of. The last few years, while quite stressful, have also been quite profitable for farmers. And historically, windfall profits tend to lead to expansion within the industry, which is exactly what we saw in the aftermath of the 2015 outbreak. Within a few years, production levels had grown to a staggering 344 million, which, if you remember from a few slides back, is the exact opposite scenario of what we're seeing now, where we had far more chickens than we did people, and the result was a 58-cent market. And then lastly, on a more macro level, I think something to be aware of is dietary trends that are developing and the overall impact on demand. A recent report from Bloomberg said that 1 in 8 Americans have tried Ozempic or some other variation of a GLP-1 drug, and over 60% of users are spending less on restaurants and buying fewer items in the supermarket. Along with other trends like intermittent fasting, you can't help but think that there is going to be some long-term demand loss as a result. So that is it for me. With that, I will now turn it over to Fabienne, who will walk you through what's happening in the EU.
Thank you very much, Karin, and hi everybody. So my name is Fabienne O'Donoghue. I'm market reporter for Barry now Expana. I joined in 2021. So as a specialist of market intelligence, I cover several commodities in Europe, including the egg product market in the EU. So every week I discuss with major market players, sellers, and buyers to understand price movements and the factors impacting them, produce commentary and analysis of the EU egg market. I was at the IEC in Edinburgh in April, and I should be attending the Egg Trade even in November, as well as Food Ingredient in Frankfurt. So do not hesitate to contact me if you would like to meet up. Next, please. All right, so first, let's have a look at the situation for table egg prices this year. We can observe that shell egg prices have now stabilized from the decline initiated after Easter because the relationship between supply and demand is currently rather stable. Historically, we see bottom prices reached in August, but contacts in the egg industry market this month believe that it's possible that it happens earlier this year due to tight supply. At the moment, the demand is the lowest of the year, but it will strongly increase when people will return to the cities to go back to offices and schools in a few weeks. So due to higher home consumption of eggs, supermarket sales are expected to rise in H2. And this will also drive egg product demand from the food manufacturers and food service sectors, for example, school canteens in September. This also includes the preparation for Christmas and New Year specialties, which will boost egg demand in November and in December. So contacts say that unless additional supplies are provided, the market could be firming up in H2 due to increased demand. Next, please. The peak of inflation in Europe in 2022 had a strong impact on the demand for table eggs in grocery stores because in all countries, people just consumed more eggs as the cheapest protein. In 2023, inflation rates have been gradually decreasing with some stability in the first half of 2024, now hovering between 0% and 5% in all EU countries. It's surprising to see that despite this return to normal inflation rates, the demand for retail eggs in H1 remains solid. People eat more eggs, and this is not expected to change in the near future as consumer demand will rise in H2, particularly as I just mentioned in September and in December. As a result, the main challenge for EU in H2 is to provide enough egg supplies to all channels, including retail, food service, and food industry. As Karin just mentioned before, we've got 448 million inhabitants in the EU, but 387 million layers. So any internal or external factor in H2 could easily impact market prices, which are currently in a position of fragile balance. Next, please. So let's now look at the external demand. EU egg exports slowed down from 21 to 23, while imports progressed. Exports gradually declined due to both short supplies in the EU and lower demand abroad, namely from Asia on egg powders. On the other hand, imports were expected to decline this year because no severe outbreaks of bird flu were registered in Europe. However, imports remained rather strong. So 2024 seems to draw a different scenario as both imports and exports so far are progressing. Of course, we'll come back to this a little bit more in detail. Next, please. Right. So in terms of production, it's difficult to get solid numbers at this stage. However, the latest forecast from the EU in spring 2024 announces a yearly production of 6.04 million of tons of eggs. It's impossible to compare with the total in 2023, but they calculated that Germany may decline production by 0.7% this year and 5.8% for Netherlands. We don't know about the other producers. Now, following this estimation, 4 countries provide 58% of the total egg production. So this is France, Spain, Germany, and Italy. And it's important to note that they all mainly consume the eggs on their respective domestic markets, which leave little space for shell egg surplus or exports. Now, the Netherlands is a different situation. They produce 8% of eggs in the EU, but it's the #1 exporter intra and extra EU with 34% of exports. However, the new Dutch government is now trying to reduce agricultural production because of environmental reasons. So the position of the Netherlands may be slightly weakening. Poland is also a main exporter with other type of challenges. So they're currently in the middle of the cage-free transition to develop the production of barn eggs. At the same time, they are, like many others, in direct competition with Ukraine for cage egg production in the EU. So they closely control quality and production costs to maintain relationship with EU partners. France is still the first producer in the EU in volume. They recovered from severe outbreaks of AI last year, where they lost 12% of their flock. However, despite this recovery, the current production capacity is not sufficient to cover the needs of the country. Recently, we heard that the CNPO is presenting a plan to create an additional 300 farms for layers. Germany, the production of eggs has been declining following higher production costs because male chicks are not culled anymore and have to be kept. But Germany remains a solid producer of all, very close to France volume. Spain, as a popular touristic destination, is seeing increasing number of tourists. I think it was about 85 million last year. Which boost the demand of eggs and sometimes drive processors to import raw material to fulfill the demand for the food industry and the HoReCa sector. Next, please. Right, so there are no clear indications that the egg production in the EU is on its way up for the second half of 2024. Placings of laying hens in the EU in 24 stand rather stable, slightly above last year, 0.7% increase, but 15% below 2021 levels. We know that after 21, the EU faced strong inflation on grain and energy costs and bird flu outbreaks, which reduced the EU flock of laying hens. But last year, with good market prices, farmers used molting techniques to keep the flocks longer, and flock rotations were delayed. Now, on the graph below, we observe that feed costs are down, which drive lower output costs. Since the summer of 2022, so 2 years ago, the price of hen feed has been gradually decreasing. With grain supplies exported from Ukraine through the Black Sea and other routes. However, with cold and wet weather this spring in many EU countries, the EU grain harvest suffered, and feed costs are expected to rise again in the next months. Next, please. Now, in the EU, the cage-free transition is on its way with an objective set for 2025. Now, there's no actual law, but just a commitment from the EU to end cage housing. This trend is now observed in all continents. However, consumers are also cautious of their spendings, and they often choose the cheapest cage-free option, which is barn. In the top 10 of the largest country producing eggs, 6 are now at least 65% cage-free. However, the progression slowed down last year due to major factors impacting egg producers. So first, the unprecedented crisis of avian influenza. During this period, as you know, all hens in the geographical area of the outbreak had to be confined. And after 4 months of lockdown, the eggs had to be downgraded to barn instead of free range. Secondly, with strong inflation rate impacting all sectors, egg producers saw their building work bills soaring, and many could not afford such increase and postponed the transition project. Now, last changing housing type to go cage-free means that the space left per hen is larger, from 720 centimeters square per hen for cage against 1,100 centimeters square for cage-free barn. So this means a 52% increase. So more space is required when producers want to keep the same number of hens, and if producers can't expand their domain, they have to manage with a smaller flock of layers. At the moment, 15 out of 27 countries are at 50% cage and above. But these countries altogether represent 40% of the total hens in the EU because many of them are actually smaller producers. Next, please. Right, so with these issues in terms of egg production, EU domestic egg supply is often not sufficient for the overall demand when including the needs for the industry. Compared with 2021, before the double-digit inflation and the damages of avian influenza, imports of shell eggs quadrupled at 398%. And 57% for egg products. As you remember, in 2023, a large number of laying hens had to be killed due to bird flu, so imports of eggs in the first 5 months jumped year on year by 240%. So this is from January to May, comparing with 2023. In these first 5 months of 2024, despite the absence of bird flu, imports increased further by 23% for shell egg and 13% for egg products year on year. So this ongoing trend is attributed to the insufficient domestic production compared with the dynamic demand in retail. Also, there's the free trade agreement with Ukraine as it facilitates the entry of eggs at prices below EU market levels. But we'll come back to this in the next slide. Next slide, please. Right, so what do we import? The large majority so far this year, January to May, are shell eggs at 79%, and the rest are egg products. Within egg products, liquid whole egg represent 42% of the volume purchased and 36% for dried whole eggs. Next is yolk, 10% for liquid and 9% for powder, and liquid and dried egg white imports are minor at around 2%. Our main partner, so in 2024, Ukraine has a 68% market share in EU egg imports, which makes it the main supplier. Next is the UK at 12%, and they used to be the number one exporter to the EU before Brexit and bird flu damages in the EU. Turkey is a major producer of cage eggs, and they represent 8% of EU imports, but their main market is now the Middle East, as Ukraine cannot easily access this part of the world anymore. So the position of the EU towards Ukraine agricultural imports is delicate. They created a free trade agreement to support the Ukrainian economy during the war, but it led to farmers' protests in the EU as large volumes of cereals, sugar, honey, eggs entered the EU market at lower prices. As a result, the new version of the agreement this year includes emergency breaks for some agricultural goods, including eggs. So we're talking about 23,000 tons in 2024. So this quota was reached in June, which means that egg imports are not taxed when entering the EU at 30.40 euro per 100 kilo. For next year, the quota up to June is 9,662 tons. And then I guess the free trade agreement will be redecided again. So the results of this emergency breaks are not reported yet in numbers, as new import figures are unavailable. But contacts report that Ukrainian suppliers often absorb these custom fees to remain competitive. So per kilo, it's about 30 cents. Also, these duties do not apply to egg products. So egg processors still compete directly with Ukraine. But again, it's not really black and white because as we saw previously, eggs in the EU sometimes come in short supply. So many food manufacturers actually welcome these additional volumes available on the market. Next slide, please, Karen. Right, in terms of exports, looking at January to May volume, this is the data that we've got available so far. As you can see, last winter, EU egg exports progressed sharply between December and April. They reached 16.3 thousand tons in May. This is due to a 34% increase for shell eggs and a 13% increase for egg products. However, so I'm talking about this increase here if you follow my cursor. However, when comparing with previous years, the volume of shell eggs exported in 2024 has been quite steady, and we observe a 20% year-on-year progression for egg products. More than half of the egg and egg product volume exported out of the EU are going to the UK and a short quarter to Switzerland. Looking at export revenue and also destinations. So this time, you know, we're looking at thousands of euro. We've got nearly 128 million euro of exports so far this year, but this is down 13.4% compared with last year, 16% for exports towards the UK, and less 43% for Japan. However, exports to Switzerland progressed by 10% and 92% for Thailand and 406% for Russia. Next, please. Right, so EU egg product exports. The first source of export revenue for processors used to be egg white powder, but it's now overtaken by whole egg liquid. You can see here. Because of a strong drop in demand for albumin powders from Asia and namely Japan, between January and May 2024, egg white powder export revenue dropped by 27% year on year, and whole egg powder followed the same change with a 19% decline. Yolk items are more in demand with 19% progression so far this year and 7% for liquid yolk. Now, the latest numbers in May are showing a revenue increase for all egg product items between 4% and 30%, depending on the product. However, it's not possible to confirm that this is the start of a positive trend because we're still in the summer and this period is historically less dynamic. Next, please. Right, so nearly there. Now I'm just looking at egg product prices. The egg white series, liquid and dry, have been most impacted by the drop in demand. They are in white on the graph. So this is year on year when looking at the month of July, it's a 45% drop for egg white powder and a 35% drop for liquid egg white. So I'm talking about euro per kilo. Yolk slightly dropped after Easter 2023 and Easter this year as well, but prices recovered to 3% year on year thanks to a fair to good demand in liquid and dried yolk. Also, the low value of egg white limited the separation activity, leaving on-demand only production of yolk. Now, when looking at whole egg powder, like egg white powder, it's been suffering from lower demand. It's a drop of 20% we observe here year on year in July, and no indication shows that the negative trend currently observed in 2024 could change direction. As usually observed for whole egg liquid, prices are following quite closely the fluctuations of raw material. So it's currently stable, but year on year drop is about 11%. Now, just raw material. Okay, after Easter, the cost of eggs for breaking followed a gradual decline. It's seasonal, similar to what we've seen as an average in the last 5 years. However, the drop stopped by the end of June and stabilized since then. So prices seem to have reached bottom levels this year earlier than the previous years and above values observed in July. The most recent price report that we published last week shows cage prices at around 1.26 euro per kilo as an average. It was 1.05 last year, so it's a drop of 20%, and 0.90 euro per kilo, so 90 cents, which is a drop of 39% compared to our 5-year average. Now we've got higher production costs. We're not sure that prices may be coming back under €1 for the different reasons that I have mentioned before. So H2 is expected to see an increase in industry egg prices, which should drive the entire egg product complex into a firmer market. Next, please. Right. So now what can be remembered from these slides. One of the first key factor, of course, to keep an eye on is the demand, the consumer demand of table eggs and elaborated food. I mean, table eggs consumption has been increasing year on year. However, in terms of elaborated food, despite the lack of numbers, we've got feedback from market players which are worried and cautious about the second half of this year. And of course, keeping an eye as well on the Asian demand for egg powders, as this is the highest revenue for our exports of egg products. Keeping an eye, of course, on the EU egg supplies. The EU egg production, when the demand recovers in September, might not be enough. And also, what will be the impact of imports from Ukraine with prices below EU level, and how will EU farmers react against this sort of second level of prices. Now, in terms of feed cost, of course, it's the first element that is a part of the production costs. So there's possible increase of feed cost in H2, leading to higher production costs. And last, avian influenza, even if last year has been rather quiet in terms of the disease, we don't know yet the impact of vaccination. Some tests are being prepared in the Netherlands, for example, and in France, ducks have been vaccinated last year. But because generally in Europe there was very limited outbreaks, we don't know if this vaccination on ducks was actually successful. And also, of course, the possible variant of the disease that may appear on the market, and then make these vaccinations inefficient. Right, so this is all for me. Thank you very much. I am giving you back now to Noah. Noah or Karin? Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fabian. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. As we said before, the recording and the deck will go out to you as attendees here. If you have any questions or you're looking to contact either Karen or Fabian, please refer back to the link that is pinned in chat here. Thank you everyone for attending, and we will go ahead and end off the webinar now. The recording will be sent to you shortly after in about an hour or two. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.